It seems shoegaze has changed dramatically over the past 3 decades. Pedal boards are getting smaller, musicians are less schizophrenic, and the sound is being combined with other styles in a way that seems antithetical to the genre in the 90s. In just 30 years, shoegaze has transformed from a genre that cost thousands to record and produce, with sleepless freakazoids dedicating their entire lives to the arrangement of effects and technology in such a way as to create the perfect reverb-ridden noisy tone, to a genre that can easily be created in somebody's bedroom for completely free, without even the need for any guitar pedals or even in some cases an actual physical guitar. Multiple things could explain this phenomenon. Music-based software is more accessible in the modern day, the genre is perhaps more popular than it's ever been, and of course the development of technology and its ability to affect music creation is continuing to advance in a way that makes it almost impossible to follow and stay ahead of. It's clear an influx in the sophistication and accessibility of music-based technology has heavily affected the way in which the music as a whole is created, marketed and presented, with no genre perhaps presenting this more than shoegaze. The genre is more popular than it's ever been in the modern day, with both the 90s and more modern production methods being celebrated equally by online fans. Despite this, there has to be some sort of overarching consequence of the continuous watering down of music production in regards to genres such as shoegaze, although I think we are getting a little bit ahead of ourselves already. Before we dive deep into this disoriented yap session, how was shoegaze produced in the 90s, and how does it differ from the production of the genre in the modern day?
Julia, is that you?
Yeah.
You good?
Yeah, I'm good. The algorithm hasn't been treating me too nicely, but do you want... I got some merch misinformation spreader. It's a funny joke from the channel. Long sleeves, look. Long sleeves with the sleeves. What we got?
I don't know.
T-shirts?
I think I'm... Whoa, chill. Bro. Where's he gone?
My merch link in description. My merch link in description. My merch link in description.
The genre that was originally utilized as an insult to poke fun at the awkward guitarists that seemingly stared at their shoes during performances, although in reality were just making sure the tone knob on each of their effects pedals were in the correct place, was a genre that pedaled off of the development of music technology in the late 80s and 90s, with the style's precursors relying heavily on effects pedals and amplifiers to achieve their desired sound. This clearly presents a higher level of effort and commitment required to be a shoegaze artist in the 90s, and contrasts the modern method of dragging countless effect presets onto a track until it sounds good. When exploring the tedious and often overcumbering production of early shoegaze, no album is more relevant than the production of perhaps the magnum opus of shoegaze, Loveless by My Bloody Valentine, which during its recording process was overshadowed by countless unusual issues in regards to recording and production. Unlike today, the 90s posed a huge problem towards the creative process of experimental and boundary-pushing rock music. This came in the form of funding, which more often than not came directly from record labels, with these same labels assigning studio engineers to the bands for the recording and production. These studio engineers were often classically taught and had a particular idea on how music should be made, with the early shoegaze pioneers attempting to go against literally every rule of traditional music production. This was the case for shoegaze pioneers My Bloody Valentine, who for the creation of perhaps the most celebrated shoegaze album Loveless were put up in countless budget recording studios by Creation Records, with every session ending with the engineer refusing to allow MBV mastermind Kevin Shields to produce the sounds that he wanted to, resulted in Shields storming out and starting the process over again with another equally disgruntled engineer. This This continued until Creation appointed My Bloody Valentine the engineer Alan Moulder, with Shields and Moulder building a level of trust and relationship that allowed for the recording and finalization of the album. One of the big issues that immediately presented itself during the production of Loveless was surprisingly not the recording of the reverb-ridden guitars, but actually the bass. They originally attempted to use a high-quality Warwick bass, and although it sounded perfect on its own, was dwarfed by the rest of the overcrowded noise of guitars and effects, suffocating every song. This led to a lot of experimenting in regards to bass tone, with the final product utilizing a headless Steinberger bass. Although the bass was able to achieve the perfect tone, Shields found it was only suitable when the strings were fresh, resulting in the instrument being swapped out constantly. This fresh string obsession followed Shields through every instrument utilized for the album that required strings. Shields' insane standards reached further than just guitar strings, however. As opposed to utilizing a Focusrite Scarlett in the modern day to record, Loveless all had to be recorded using microphones and specific amplifier combinations. This presented an issue when it became obvious that Shields was unhappy with any room sound or tone being present within the music, regardless of how minimal it may be, with the solution coming in the form of Shields positioning the mic as close to the amps as possible. This would be fine if a little bit of compression was allowed, but once again, Shields' insane commitment to his craft alongside the limitations of technology prohibited this. If a microphone was set up in a room, he would immediately scream as loud as possible into that mic to test for any compression and demand it be turned off if he could hear any, which makes absolutely zero sense, by the way. Screaming is a whole lot louder than the indie soft voice singing Shields would utilize on the album. When creating a project as revolutionary and genre defining as Loveless, a particular industry or genre standard has not yet been set, with the results of this clearly being seen in the production methods surrounding the guitars on the album. Each song on the album used completely different setups, different amps, different pedals, even amp positions. The problem with utilizing countless different pedals and effects units in different combinations is first, the sheer expense of it all, and second, the experimentation needed to find the right sounds and mix and master the tones effectively. Microphone positions and pedal settings were consistently altered until the right tone was found, with the recording process just involving Kevin Shields playing the entire song in one go front to back to make sure each of the effects and reverb tails were recorded effectively. Shoegaze is guitar music at heart, and during its birth, Shields utilized the guitar to create any sort of sound he was interested in including in the music, including the flute, with this flute tone being created by sampling guitar feedback and messing with the effects until he achieved his desired outcome. It wasn't as simple as just dragging and dropping a sample and dropping a few effects on it. The arduous and seemingly mentally painful sounding production of Loveless highlights the resources and most importantly talent it took to create the boundary-pushing style of music in the early days. Loveless was only possible due to the fact that Kevin Shields was an incredibly weird individual, a chinchilla-obsessed insomniac that somehow decided to revolve his life around creating an incredibly strange and noisy form of guitar music that hadn't seen too much overarching success in the past outside of Cocteau Twins and Jesus and the Mary Chain. The question that seems to be looming above us is as follows: if Kevin Shields had access to samples, digital effects, and Fruity Loops, would he have been able to make Loveless, or would he just be a trap producer advertising his beats on videos of Indians being hit by trucks on Instagram Reels? To present that question in a less schizophrenic way, did the limitations in technology and capabilities allow for a sound that was truly unique, or would the technology in the modern day have perhaps made Loveless even better, with a production process that didn't result in the band's drummer going catatonic due to stress? It's hard to tell, although there is one thing we do know. When My Bloody Valentine started the creation of their shoegaze style, there wasn't already a market present for the band and style. Quite the opposite. Most people fucking hated them due to how loud they were at shows. This contrasts the modern day greatly in the fact that today shoegaze already has a built-in dedicated audience that is consistently willing to support the genre and discover new bands. This, alongside an increase in accessibility in terms of the production of music, music gives space for bands to create their art in any way they want without the risk of being booted out of recording studios or dropped by money-obsessed record labels. This may seem like a privilege that is only present within modern-day shoegaze scenes, although it was actually somewhat the case in a post-My Bloody Valentine UK music scene in the 90s. After MBV and contemporaries chucked their shoegaze-themed shit into the British music scene and somehow allowed it to reach the mainstream, smaller bands within the style were beginning to receive label attention, with the most prominent being Slowdive. Despite the fact that labels and engineers were well aware of the music the band wished to create when they were signed, Slowdive still faced various problems that perhaps dwarfed My Bloody Valentine in terms of the health and long-term stability of the band, and 100% dwarfed many of the problems that any modern-day band would potentially face. This problem came in the form of the British music journalists of the time, who had a huge say on what was and wasn't cool within the music scene. The lack of internet meant that listeners were reliant on these journalists when deciding what to listen to, meaning these people had a huge influence over record sales and concert attendance, which ultimately ended Slowdive's short career entirely after snot-dripping journalists viciously insulted many of their projects. But why did Slowdive become a target for England's most musically pretentious? Well, it wasn't originally the case. At first, Slowdive were heavily praised by the UK's music press. When they first burst onto the music scene as teenagers, Slowdive were incredibly well received. The textures, vocals, and unique chords that could only come from a songwriter who exclusively listened to classical music as a child appealed to the same journalists that would later end their career, resulting in multiple singles of the week. Slowdive were initially lucky in the fact that their career started around a time where My Bloody Valentine had allowed the style of music to be somewhat popular, resulting in an already present fan base and healthy scene for the band. For a short period of time, everything was perfect. Shoegaze could do nothing wrong, although much like my performance within the YouTube algorithm, please subscribe to my second channel, please. Music genres at the time were consistently thrust from the mainstream to obscurity in only a matter of months. Slowdive seemingly out of nowhere began receiving negative reviews, despite the fact that the music was very similar and the reviews came from the exact same journalists. The music that would later be hailed as perfect by similarly pretentious was flat, uncool, and uninspired. This may seem like a completely random tirade against the band and the style of music, although there were a few musical elements beginning to bubble up in culture around this time. Across the pond within the United States, junkies were beginning to grow their hair long and dribble incoherent male manipulator rambles over power chords, and back in the United Kingdom, rowdy troglodytes with haircuts and an inability to sing without resembling an overworked donkey were becoming a little bit too inspired by the Beatles. Britpop and grunge had truly left shoegaze in the dust culturally, just to rot away into introverted obscurity. Despite all this, Slowdive decided to ignore all the negative attention and just attempted to create their music in the way they wanted to create it without any outside influence. This spurt of negative attention occurred just before the creation of perhaps the second greatest shoegaze album of all time. Well, that's if you're a regular on Rate Your Music, Souvlaki. Much of the album's lyrical and emotional inspiration would be birthed out of a breakup between two of the band's key members, Neil Halstead and Rachel Goswell. Initially, the breakup would negatively affect Neil's songwriting abilities. This continued until Neil was told to shut his mouth and was immediately thrown into a cottage in Wales for 2 weeks with only a 4-track and enough instruments to write as many songs as possible. This surprisingly actually resulted in 4 songs, which were subsequently recorded, although unlike today, Slowdive didn't have access to brain rot YouTube tutorials, meaning they had absolutely zero knowledge in terms of mixing their music effectively, and would just turn every knob up to full and harass the eardrums with insane walls of noise. This resulted in the need for a professional engineer who was able to effectively reduce the creative vision of the band to the point where the music was actually listenable. One particularly interesting aspect of the recording of Souvlaki is the band's ability to work alongside the godfather of ambient, Brian Eno, with the first session involving Neil playing a section of guitar for 10 minutes before changing emotion, tone, and motif, with Eno experimenting with production techniques and effects on each of these guitar tracks. This session resulted in a collection of repetitive repetitive, textured guitar ambience, which just so happened to be completely out of time, meaning the drummer was forced to play along and write to out of time walls of guitar, fuzzed noise, resulting in a unique rhythm and swing on the eventual Souvlaki. Although Souvlaki didn't quite see the same level of stress and chaos as Loveless, which likely reduced the lifespan of multiple members, it still took countless hours of work twiddling with various pieces of technology and effects to sound not only ethereal but digestible enough to potentially cut through the Britpop spastication that was plaguing the UK at the time. Unfortunately, when Souvlaki was eventually released, it received horrendous reviews heinous enough to not only kill the band but kick its rotting corpse over and over again whilst their entire family and bloodline watched from afar. It was obvious that England at the time had no room for introspection, emotion and texture. They just wanted football hooligans, shitly poured lager and spastics in stupid outfits, rambling about being British in an overly exaggerated way. Of course, these journalists were literal spit-dribbling troglodytes and got it almost entirely wrong, with Slowdive and specifically Souvlaki being one of the most celebrated albums amongst literally every genre, let alone shoegaze, within the modern day, and inspired the modern sound tremendously. If we immediately compare the production of commonly celebrated masterpieces such as Loveless and Souvlaki to the modern day, it's very easy to see not only a clear difference in how the music is made, marketed and released, but the sound of the final products. It's rare to find a project in the modern day that has the same rawness, intensity and overarching texture as the shoegaze of the past, with many of the songs fitting into a poppy, dreamy, shoegazy bowl of slop, which often sounds very similar without as much experimentation as the bands of the past. Of course, there are many outliers, but as a whole, shoegaze is pushing boundaries far less than other contemporary modern alternative genres, which seems strange as in the 90s, shoegaze was clearly the most boundary-pushing genre of the time. Although many shoegaze bands in the modern day look towards the pioneers when forming their sound and style, an equal amount seem to be attempting to contrast the primitive, almost raw sound that came as a result of the limited technology in the 90s. They are embracing the accessibility and development of technology to create a more crisp sound, which is almost the complete opposite of the muddy walls of sound seen beforehand. This more modern, crisp sound can be easily achieved through recording directly into a computer through an interface as opposed to using tape, a recording method that gave early shoegaze much of its saturation and warmth. Although recording digitally often results in a more robotic kind of twangy sound, it has various other benefits that make the production of genres like shoegaze far easier. First of all, digital recording is much less time consuming. Plug that bitch in, adjust the levels, press the big red circle and just f***ing play, with mistakes having very little consequence as sections can just be re-recorded or edited out with just a few clicks. The dry and flat sound that comes as a result of digital recording can then just be adjusted and modified using countless effects and presets that are as simple to use as drag and drop. Based on this information, it seems like a no-brainer to utilize digital recording methods as opposed to tape. Why would a band choose to limit their layers to just 24 when there are other options that don't limit the number of layers and seem to encourage creativity? So this is the part of the video where we truly enter yap, so just be warned. Due to how easy it is to record, adjust and develop sections of the songs in the modern day, I'd argue that there is less effort and thought put into each of these individual sections. If we go back to My Bloody Valentine, for example, each layer was so meticulously crafted and well thought out. This obviously came as a result of Kevin Shields' insomnia-fueled perfectionism, but also can be thanks to the limitations of tape recording. Shields was forced to find a way to make the music incredibly powerful and full of texture in just 24 layers, which in turn resulted in more experimentation for each of those layers. Recording each of these layers was also more difficult and required far more thought. Actions that today are incredibly simple, such as recording, setting up, and achieving the desired effects, were much more difficult than just dragging, dropping, and consistently being able to experiment with very little effort. These limitations bred creativity due to the extra thought that had to be put in order to not waste more money and time during the production of the album. Technology was far more expensive in the 90s, and the effects that shoegazers had access to was extremely limited, mainly just clunky rack units that could only be used in large studios. Today it seems new shoegaze themed guitar pedals are being released released every few weeks, with the barrier to entry in terms of reverse reverb, fuzz and distortion being as low as an £80 multi-effects pedal, or even extremely cheap and definitely not pirated plugins and VSTs. When technology develops, things that used to be large, clunky and difficult to use slowly become small, accessible and as easy to work as a press of a button, and no industry presents this concept more than guitar effects. Although pedals have been around for a very long time, they have never been as accessible and plentiful as they are in the modern day. There are experimental pedals, classic pedals, multi-stomp pedals, pedals that combine other pedals into just one pedal, pedals that aim to completely emulate a style of music from the past. One type of pedal that has seen a huge surge in popularity is shoegaze pedals. The market is overflowing with multi-effects pedals that aim to emulate the effects and sound of early shoegaze, all whilst having a purple ethereal design plastered all over the metal. This influx of pedal-based technology makes shoegaze much easier to approach as a beginner or even experienced musician than it has been in the past, although it may pose an issue in terms of the originality of the tones and music being produced. As mentioned before, many of these pedals are designed to create just shoegaze, often the style of shoegaze created by the most popular bands and innovators. In the 90s, these pedals obviously did not exist and have been created off of a style of music that was primarily created using large clunky rack units such as the Yamaha SPX90. These pieces of equipment had to be adjusted in a specific way alongside other pieces of hardware to create entirely unique tones. In the modern day, musicians seem to be over encumbered by pieces of hardware that are designed for very particular things. There are so many sounds to choose from. It causes the musician to become unhealthily obsessed with the pursuit of gear. How many times have you been to a local gig and witnessed a guitarist with a pedal board that looks like a futuristic landmine? How many times has that same guitarist had an extremely unique tone? Personally, in my experience, it's very rare. Shoegaze guitarists are no longer limited by technology that has to be experimented with and tweaked consistently to create entirely unique tones. They can just slap the same effects over and over again, and although that may have reduced the prevalence of unique tones in the music, it has actually resulted in the songwriting improving tremendously, so swings and roundabouts, I suppose. Although pedals are incredibly accessible in the modern day, they can still be quite pricey, and considering most fans of shoegaze actively wear the cheapest, itchiest sweaters by choice, I doubt many of them would be willing to fork out over $1,000 for a pedal board that they would get bored of precisely 2 nanoseconds after the first strum. Luckily, pedals aren't even needed anymore, with digital effects becoming advanced to the point where they are limiting the need for even a pedal board in the modern day shoegaze. Not only are these digital effects able to replicate the sounds of these pedals, they are much more reliable, easy to tweak and adjust, and countless digital effects can be downloaded for very cheap or even free, and combined in a way that doesn't require an individual to be consistently selling and buying new pedals. So that may explain why shoegaze sounds different today than it did in the 90s, but raises further questions. If shoegaze was insulted to the point of obscurity in the 90s, why is there such a demand for the music in the modern day? Shoegaze's demise in the 90s was entirely due to the overarching influence of legacy media. The only reason music journalists had enough power to literally kill a genre was because there wasn't any other way to openly discuss music on a scale that was large enough to cause any influence. This quickly changed, and as the internet slowly but violently clawed its way into our lives, it introduced a new way to communicate, which massively affected niche interests in a way that can be seen as very positive. Forums were introduced to discuss interests that would traditionally get you severely bullied to the point of lifelong trauma if discussed in public. One of these niche interests just so happened to be shoegaze, with early Rate Your Music specifically celebrating shoegaze albums such as Loveless and Souvlaki as masterpieces and essential albums for any music fan. This obviously contrasted massively with the opinions of the journalists of the past, but guess what? The opinions of these journalists didn't matter anymore. All of a sudden, Jim, who sits at home and passionately discusses shoegaze on free forums, has far more influence than a pretentious, snot-dribbling, tantrum-throwing journalist. Jim, the shoegaze neckbeard, also has no financial incentive to describe music in any particular way, so will truly share his opinion in a genuine manner, whereas the journalists of the past were inclined to be a slave to negativity and sensationalization, so people would actually pay attention to their script writing. In the 90s, albums and bands were insulted so publications could make more money, but in the modern day, opinions are discussed freely and openly, which just so happened to thrust shoegaze into the forefront of music discussion, which therefore means more memes, more posts, more search results, and eventually the algorithm understands all of this and shoves it down the throat of everyone who decided to grow a mullet in 2020. There is one problem with internet-based communication, however. Information can very quickly and easily be diluted and misunderstood. Most people who are able to discuss music online have no clue what the fuck they are talking about, and that includes me, by the way. I've just schizophrenically rambled my way through this entire thing. I don't even know what a bloody Valentine is. This has affected shoegaze in a uniquely terminally online way, due to the fact that shoegaze as a genre definition is already strange and confusing as a result of the term's origin and the experimental nature of the bands it was originally coined to define. The genre label has been subject to some confusion as of late. It seems pretty much every band that utilizes a thick, heavy guitar tone with reverb and distortion is immediately given the label of shoegaze. It is stretched and morphed what it even means to fit into the genre. Bands that sound nothing like My Bloody Valentine or Slowdive are now labeled as shoegaze, which in turn has spread the sound to countless more ears and eyes. People who may not even like shoegaze are now able to listen to music that wouldn't typically be considered shoegaze, although it is labeled as such by online fans and, more importantly, streaming services. This can mainly be chalked up to the fact that shoegaze as a genre label is pretty stupid to begin with. Much like grunge, shoegaze is just used to define a specific style of music at a specific time. The only reason it was utilized in the first place is because the bands and scenes within the UK needed a catchy label for journalists to spit, gurgle and regurgitate all over paper for a monthly paycheck. That then causes difficulty when this same label definition sticks around for decades due to the inherent quality of the original songs. Music fans who learn about shoegaze in the modern day are highly unlikely to attribute the term to a particular feeling of a scene within the UK in the 90s, and if they're American, they probably can't even place Reading or Ireland on a map. They are more likely going to connect it to a particular sound, which in the case of shoegaze is distorted reverb heavy guitars. This then connects the genre to bands like Deftones and Duster, who, although can be seen as equally good, don't share the same insanity-inducing production as the original shoegaze bands. This seems to have led the genre down a path that incorporates more nu metal and grunge elements, which contrasts with the intense experimentation that was key to the earliest of shoegaze bands, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's inevitable that genres are going to continue to develop, melding with whatever may be popular or influential at the time or in the past. Although it is hard to ignore the fact that shoegaze does seem to be stagnating in the modern day. It feels like when listening to new shoegaze bands, outside of a few examples of course, I'm either getting dreamy ethereal noise akin to Slowdive or a reverb-ridden grunge or metal track with extremely horny vocals. The genre doesn't seem to have the same experimentation it once did, with my hypothesis to why this is being almost entirely based on the development of technology. Technology has made shoegaze not only extremely popular through online discussion, but way easier to make through developments in technology that aids with the production of music. Technology has also allowed for a free flow of discussion, which in turn means less risk of sounds and styles being put into claustrophobic boxes. The consequence of this is more mainstream, less experimental sounds and styles like nu metal and grunge being inherently inserted into the genre of shoegaze. This is bound to change the way in which the music sounds and is received, and whether that's a good or bad thing is up to you. Realistically, music is always going to be made based on the influences of the past. The only time that wasn't the case is when Grug first rhythmically banged a rock against the cave wall in prehistory before using that same rock to bash in his wife's head. It is inevitable that shoegaze will begin to develop at one point, and in some cases it's even happening now. It's rare stagnation continues for too long in underground scenes, because at some point you're going to get a motherfucker akin to Kevin Shields, who uses a nice combination of being on the spectrum and not being able to sleep. Although I'm not sure if that's a good thing. I don't think we need another schizophrenic insomniac motherfucker obsessed with guitar music. That shit might algorithmically end TikTok forever. Can you just imagine the thirst edits?